Good morning. My name is Richard Hanley. I'm a professor at City Tech, and thank you all for coming. That was a pretty neat video leading us into some of the things that can be done to mitigate, alleviate, deal with the damage of climate change and our climate crisis that we're experiencing. And now I want to introduce you to a panel of speakers who are going to be talking about some of the ways in which people are addressing climate change or proposing to. And our first speaker is very relevant in terms of where we are, that is, we meaning City Tech, where we are at along the Brooklyn waterfront, because there's a very significant development with wind power that is coming our way, that for you, our students, not only will this be beneficial to the environment, but this particular way of addressing climate change comes with the possibility of many well-paying jobs. And so perhaps these are in our future as well. And so I would like to introduce first Alba Pena, who is the New York City Community Engagement Manager of a company called Equinor that has the contract to develop wind power offshore in the Atlantic Ocean. And so without further ado, welcome, Alba.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Richard, for the warm introduction. Thank you all for joining. As a native New Yorker myself who grew up in environmental justice communities, I am beyond thrilled to join you all today to share with you a little bit about who we are, what we do, and how our work is going to bring positive and exciting change to our communities. To give me 1 second, I'll be sharing my screen because I have a presentation to share with you. And hopefully that works perfectly. There we go. So to start, I'll tell you a little bit about Equinor. Equinor is an international energy company headquartered in Norway. It was founded in 1972 by the Norwegian government. In 1990, we started trading publicly. And as of today, we're owned by the Norwegian people. 67% of the company is owned by the Norwegian people. Our purpose is to turn natural resources into energy for people and progress for society. Our strategy is to always remain safe. We pride ourselves on our values, which are open, courageous, collaborative, and caring. And our vision is to shape the future of energy. Now, Equinor has more than 10 years of experience in the offshore wind sector. And what you're looking at is a map of our portfolio worldwide. If you would take your attention to the sector in the middle, the cluster in the middle, under the North Sea section, you'll see the biggest offshore wind farm. The name is Dogger Bank. It has an installed capacity of 3.6 gigawatts, and it is based off of the northeast coast of England. It is expected to power about 6 million homes in England, so that's a huge project. In 2016, we decided that the future of energy is in the US, and I'm sure you're all familiarized with the Biden administration announcement this morning about the ambitious goals the US has to reduce greenhouse emissions in the US. So this is quite relevant. I want to bring your attention to our portfolio on the US East Coast. So we leased in 2016 project areas for Empire Wind 1, Empire Wind 2, and Bacon Wind. And as you can see, we are materializing our position in the offshore wind sector across the world but we're also looking into future growth opportunities in Asia. Before I get into our projects in the US, I want to take you back to the basics, because I'm sure a lot of you are not familiar with what an offshore wind farm consists of. So I want to take you through the 4 components. Typically, an offshore wind farm has this section over here, an offshore wind farm with turbines. The turbines themselves have different components. So there's a foundation, a tower. We have a nacelle hub, which essentially houses all of the generating components of a turbine. And then we have the blades right here. The turbines are then interconnected by array cables which transmit the, let me select that, transmit the kinetic energy to the offshore substation, which then converts that energy and prevents any sort of energy loss and transmits it to the onshore substation at section 3. That energy is then transmitted to the electrical grid in the community. For all intents and purposes, our electrical grid would be the Canadian company. So then they would distribute energy to the local community, which is over here. Area 4, it's what we call their operational and maintenance space. And you typically see an SOV, which is a service operation vessel, which travels back and forth from the offshore wind farm onto base to replenish, refuel, and reprovision. We usually have a crew that is housed in the vessel for 2 weeks, and then the crew is shifted out with another crew to service the wind farm. Now that you understand the basics of an offshore wind farm, I want to talk to you about our very first project, which was awarded to us by NYSERDA in 2019. And this would be this green section right here. It's Empire Wind. So these areas south of the Long Island shore. And we're interconnecting this area up onto the South Brooklyn area. We proposed that most of the assembly or all of the assembly for this project to be at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, which is very, very exciting. We're also going to have our operations and maintenance hub in South Brooklyn. The turbines will be assembled and a lot of other components in this area. Our intent is to use gravity-based foundations for the turbines to the largest extent possible, because these foundations will reduce the need for us to use noise reduction technology in the ocean or the waters. We're expecting this project to become operational in the mid-2020s. It has an installed capacity of 816 megawatts, and that would power about 500,000 homes in the Brooklyn community. To give you a sense of a project timeline, this is our estimated project timeline for Empire Wind. As you can see, it's very, very lengthy from the time that we received our lease area in around 2016, 2017, to the time that we're able to actually begin construction and fabrication. You're looking at about 7 years. This is because there's a lot of work that goes into this. We have to do a lot of environmental assessments, not just to be responsible ourselves, but to conform with the state and federal permitting processes. We do a lot of analysis with wildlife, marine life, a lot of stakeholders before we can even get the permits to begin construction for these projects. Now, the timeline will vary across different projects, and you'll see that later in the presentation for Empire Wind 2 and Beacon 1, which are our 2 latest awards, only because we're using synergies between the two. Those projects will be using some of the components that we would have already had in place because of Empire Wind 1. On this map, you'll see Empire Wind 2 and Beacon Wind 1, which are our 2 latest projects. They were awarded to us at the beginning of the year in 2021. And I'll show you, earlier I mentioned Empire Wind 1 in this area, south of Long Island, interconnecting into the South Brooklyn substation. Empire 2 would be this lower area, but it will interconnect into the Barrett Station in Long Island. This project is expected to have an installed capacity of 1,260 megawatts. And then we have Beacon Wind, which essentially is the upper half of this polygon, which will be interconnected directly into the Astoria substation in Queens. Something different about Beacon Wind is that we'll be using HVDC technology, which will eliminate power loss for projects that are across long distance. So this project extends beyond 50 miles from shore, so that will eliminate power loss from this project. Beacon Wind is expected to have an installed capacity of 1,230 megawatts, and combined, these projects are potentially going to power about 1.3 million homes. So that's huge for New York. In our proposals, we also included $47 million as a commitment to workforce development, community development, and innovation, as well as $25 million to support our regional efforts when it comes to wildlife and commercial fish stocks. We are expecting these projects to produce about 5,200 total direct jobs and a combined $4.5 billion in value added to the New York State economy. I had mentioned earlier that our staging and assembly base was proposed to be at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal Port. So what you're looking at here is a rendering of what that would look like. You'll see some of the components. These are wind turbine components. Some of the towers, some of the blades would be assembled at SBMT. It is one of the largest dedicated offshore wind port facilities in the US. We have a 10-year lease for this area, and we are open to subleasing the area in between projects to avoid any sort of work gaps and ensure that the facility is being used throughout our projects if we have any gaps in between, let's say Empire Wind 1 and Empire Wind 2, so it doesn't go unused and beyond our us finishing our own operations in the area. We're expecting this project to produce about 1,000 assembly jobs, and that consists of the assembly of the turbines, and then an additional 200 jobs for those that are maintaining the facility. Something exciting is that we are also establishing a community engagement center. We're hoping to house the community engagement center in our future office, which it's expected to be adjacent to the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal Port. So we're looking forward to having that community engagement center and be able to support our educational efforts as well as our outreach within the South Brooklyn community. What you see here is another rendering. On the left side, there's this gray wall that is expected to be our onshore substation. And then here we'll have an operations and maintenance base. And this is the base where I had mentioned we're going to have vessels supporting this station. They'll return every 2 weeks for crew change, refueling, and for provisioning. But this is what we expect this space to look like once we construct. Another aspect of our bid is that we proposed the very, very first offshore wind tower manufacturing facility in the US. And it's to be housed at Port of Albany. We're partnering with wind tower experts Marmon and Welcon. Those are Canadian and Danish companies that are experts in manufacturing wind towers. We're expecting this project to produce 500 short-term jobs. And when I say short-term, it's because these jobs are essentially the workers that are going to be building the factory, and then an additional 200 long-term jobs. And those are the jobs that will be assembling the components for the wind towers. We're hoping that this will become operational in 2023. We're very, very excited about this very first offshore wind tower facility because it will service all of our projects. So that would be Empire Wind 1, Empire Wind 2, and Beacon Wind. I've talked a lot about the jobs that these projects will produce, and I wanted to mention our continued collaboration with a lot of educational institutions as well as labor unions to ensure that there is a just transition. We are aware that some of our local workers may have a skills gap, considering that this is a really, really new industry. And so we want to make sure that they have the necessary certification and training, because our purpose and goal is to hire locally. We're working in collaboration with the New York Offshore Wind Training Institute, which was created at the beginning of the year by NYSERDA in collaboration with SUNY Stony Brook. This is essentially a list of some of the institutions that we're working with. We are engaging with a lot of other organizations beyond this list, but this gives you a good sense of the communications that we're having across the board with educational institutions, as well as environmental organizations and labor unions. As I mentioned earlier, we have a huge commitment to community. Our projects would not be feasible without us engaging the community and ensuring that no concern and no community is overlooked when we are in construction of these projects. So we are doing a lot of studies, a lot of data mapping to ensure that we are performing responsibly and are doing well by our communities. We are also consulting a lot with environmental justice communities, seeking cleaner air. It's job training, workforce development. We're going to continue to have these conversations. We're hoping that once everything becomes or gets a sense of normalcy, we're able to have these events in person to engage even more stakeholders throughout our efforts. I'll leave you with my contact information in the event that you have any questions or concerns that you may not be able to address throughout this panel. But I am excited to have shared this information with you. I hope that it's invigorating and that it excites you as it excites me to learn that we are making change for a better environment as a whole and as a community. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Alba. Thank you, Alba. What I could ask, okay, great. You're stopping sharing your screen. I should have mentioned before that what you can do is if you have questions, and I see there are already a couple of questions for Alba, but we will take all questions at the end of the presentations. And so if you could please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to introduce Walter Rodriguez Meyer, who is a principal at the local office landscape and design, which is a local Brooklyn company. And he is going to speak about another way of addressing, if we've had wind power to address climate issues, we're now going to hear about the role of urban and landscape design can have in mitigating, fighting, changing the climate crisis. So Walter, welcome and thank you for coming here today.
Thank you, Professor Hanley. I've been looking forward to this all day, Earth Day, and learning what I've learned. Big things from Alba today. I've been curious about the wind project and now very excited where it's going. And most importantly, the environmental justice community organizers on the last panel really inspired me about, the inside ball versus outside ball discussion that was happening on community organizing. So I'm going to share my screen really quick and dive into it. I'm going to show you projects in New York as well as down in the Caribbean in Puerto Rico. So 1 second. Okay. Share. Do an audio check. How's my audio sounding?
Your audio is fine.
Okay, great. Okay. So I'm a professor at Parsons School of Design in Manhattan, as well as principal of LOLA, Local Office Landscape and Urban Design, as Richard pointed out. And I'm also the executive director of the Coastal Marine Resource Center of Puerto Rico. It's an NGO that mostly focuses on resilient energy. The first project I'll show you is out in the coastal zone of New York City, out in Rockaway, a barrier island that's part of Queens. And our firm, LOLA, has done work for the adjacent island, city of Long Beach in Nassau County, a comprehensive resiliency plan. We've also worked in the nearby island of Coney Island, working on a tidal wetland barrier study. But the project I'm going to show you today is New York City's first fossil fuel-free neighborhood. That means all of its energy is coming from the site. All the buildings are using electrification and are ultra efficient through passive house standards and geothermal heating and cooling. Now, geothermal doesn't mean getting, volcanic energy or lava or anything like that. It's actually just getting the groundwater temperature. And that possibility comes from the area of the glacial till in New York City, which the glacial till line was an area where the Wisconsin Glacier, tens of thousands of years ago, came down from Canada, made its way down and stopped in the middle of Brooklyn, essentially. And so from that line south is some of the most cost-effective heating and cooling resource in the state, which is what I call geothermal country. Geothermal country means that it's a term that I coined, which means that it's a part of New York City where the soil is very porous, the groundwater is elevated, and good thermal conductivity, which means transferring groundwater temperature into your building very efficiently through what are essentially pipes underground. And it's an efficient way of getting almost free heating and cooling from the earth. And this project is in Eastern Rockaway. And one of the drivers there is groundwater flooding is a hazard. And this area in white that you see in this image is a freshwater lens of rainwater that's floating on top of salt that bubbles up at high tide. This is a neighborhood that's already susceptible to climate change. And in the long term, there's discussions about retreat. And in the midterms, there's discussions about how you manage a retreat in terms of estate planning and not making sure that the cost of retreat is done on the backs of the working class. One way of doing that is an interim phase of thought that's called reorganization. That in the most climate or sea level rise prone areas of the city, we can reorganize the neighborhoods to build safety locally until the larger retreat efforts can get underway, which require alignment for retreat between the White House, the federal government, the state, and the city. So it's a big lift that takes multiple generations to pull off. But in the interim, there are some local devices. One of those local devices is building neighborhoods that are climate proof and able to adapt to the current situation and buy time for the existing vulnerable neighborhood around it to also adapt. This project learned a lot from the pandemic, which is that how much public realm is an active part of our community health. And so this project has a network of open spaces and urban farms that are both privately maintained as a for-profit farm, as well as commercial farms that community farms that are community-based. The project has a mix of buildings that include mixed-use buildings like you see in the outer boroughs of Queens, as well as townhouses and bungalows. It features a new brewery at the anchor of the project, and a new boutique hotel. And most of these buildings would be timber, which is a carbon banking method of constructing buildings. The neighborhood, will be a population of 5,000 people that can move from the lower parts of the neighborhood and into this upper elevated neighborhood that can handle heavy rain events as well as groundwater flooding. The buildings are themselves, our firm has designed the systems of the buildings to manage water from cloud to ground and to leverage what was a hazard, the groundwater, the former hazard, and turn it into an asset, both for irrigating the green infrastructure of the project, that is the network of natural systems that manage flooding, as well as extracting from that groundwater heating and cooling capacity, and completely getting us onto electric and no longer needing natural gas for our city in the future. The project is completely solarized. Every surface of the buildings that are now being built, in this case, this is what the second phase building to be constructed. And New York Times recently wrote an article about this project. I'm going to drop something in chat for a reference for those that are interested in learning more. In the Q&A. One second. I realize I don't have a broader chat access, but I'll drop that in later during Q&A. Excuse me. Okay. And then in addition to rooftop solar, the project integrates solar on every surface of the development. So we're looking at porous asphalt that absorbs rainwater, and above that is parking lot trellises. One thing that this project seeks to do is to formalize what is happening informally in this bohemian neighborhood of Rockaway. Right now, when you go down there, there are these Michelin-rated restaurants and their celebrity chefs doing amazing, food, sustainable food, and they're taking the locally grown produce is delivered by bike on what is New York City's bike highway that's known as the Rockaway Beach boardwalk that's 6 miles long. And so people are able to go 1 block to the boardwalk and bring with their cargo bikes, the produce that's harvested that day, and you can eat it in the restaurant and it's a few hours old. And then the waste is brought back to the community gardens. And this project is looking to take that circularity and build a regenerative system into it. What we're doing is taking anaerobic digesters that can take that restaurant waste, and instead of just composting, we can extract power from it, as well as fertigation, that is taking compost tea and selling a branded compost tea out of that. The project, as it's starting to get built, has some of the largest batteries in New York City, which has been difficult at first to permit with the fire department for interior batteries, but have now kind of broken the ice and made it easier. And now batteries are starting to become the norm in New York City. The project also leverages a new dune forest that will take the root zone of a dune forest to hold the topography to reduce any wave runup. That's important because after Hurricane Sandy, there were a lot of stories about how the coastal pine trees kept the boardwalk from destroying the neighborhood, kind of being a front bumper, first line of defense for the neighborhood. And the most interesting thing about the dunes in Rockaway is when you plant native species, nearly half of the natives are edible, which is really important to have several layers of edible food, not just in the farms, but also in the habitat. And this is an image of the main street where there's going to be a restaurant row that features a lot of Rockaway's greatest hits of small micro entrepreneur restaurants, as well as a few anchors, including a small shop, a mid-sized food market, And this image on the right, which is a timber Rockaway brewery. It's a timber building that will feature an incubator space for food entrepreneurs in the neighborhood, so that they don't have to commit to large rents to get started. They can spin off of the ecosystem of the brewery. The next project we're shifting to, we're leaving New York City and New York City's first net zero neighborhood, and we're shifting to a project that was built in Puerto Rico, in San Juan. I designed this project to be the most wind-resistant solar system ever built in the island, and it was tested by Hurricane Maria. It's a very large solar array that's 10 stories in the air, and it powers a supermarket on the ground floor, with the intention that that supermarket can keep its doors open during a disturbance such as a hurricane. We had the design for earthquakes to a California level of earthquake standard, as well as urban winds in hurricanes, which have a different characteristic than winds on a hurricane out on the beach. Why? Because of the Venturi effect of towers creating torsional winds, differential winds that lift solar arrays in different ways. And the project, this is a photo after Hurricane Maria. There was some damage, but it wasn't completely damaged. Most notably, most of the solar arrays in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, about a third of the solar panels were impacted and didn't work. We went back and did a forensic analysis on this and found that, we found some bolts that were sheared, but we only lost about 8% of the solar panels. And we call this the metrics of imperfection. While this wasn't 100% resilient, it was pretty close to it, 92%, which is quite an improvement compared to 60 or 70% standard island-wide after Maria in terms of efficacy. And so, Maria was a Cat 4 storm, came ashore, some of the heaviest winds in 90 years ever measured. And 2% of the solar modules flew off because of bolts that were sheared, human error when installing. We could overcome that in the future by larger bolts and also having more enforcement during construction to make sure the right tools are being used. The last piece of impact was 6% of the solar modules were lost to projectiles. So these are, in an urban area, you get a lot of buildings under construction with blocks, and you get a lot of coconuts flying like missiles through the air. And you can see this image on the right. There's a solar panel on the bottom right corner with a big gaping hole, that was from one of those coconuts. The reason we were able to get it less than a third impact compared to other facilities is we lowered the solar panels flatter, almost completely flat, with just enough tilt so the rainwater cleans the solar panel, but not optimized to the perfect angle. So we gave up about 5% efficiency, but we gained about 20 or 30% resiliency. So it's that balance between sustainability and resiliency in the decision making. So because of the relationship with these large solar companies, I worked with several CEOs of companies like SunPower and various others who manufacture these solar panels. And sometimes they have a lot of grade B product left over that they can't use. And because of my relationship with these CEOs, after Hurricane Maria hit, my father, who lives in the northwest corner of Puerto Rico in Isabela, he called me, said, it's really rough in the neighborhood here on the block. Everyone's impacted. I didn't know how bad it is island-wide. Well, I was able to organize with Nidia Velasquez, who is a congresswoman in our district in Brooklyn, to get 10 of our solar experts onto a plane, and Governor Cuomo helped us organize some cargo loading. And we were able to get a plane down there and do some assessments and found out how bad it was. And we were on the island 2 weeks after the hurricane. And this is the work, not through my firm, LOLA. This is the work that I volunteer my time directing the nonprofit coastalmarine.org. And this project we launched is called Solar Libre. Solar Libre just took a lot of donated materials from the mainland and worked with our logistics partners. We teamed with Hispanic Federation. We had a lot of help from the arts community, Lin-Manuel Miranda, his father Luis. We had help from Ai Weiwei, Carol Walker, the artist. There's a long list of celebrities who really stepped up and came together with surfers who go between New York and Puerto Rico. And it was kind of a shadow government in a way of the arts community, the diasporic Puerto Rican community in New York, and surfers. Why surfers? Well, this airplane that you see here was a FedEx plane that would not have been allowed to get into San Juan. So we redirected to Aguadilla Airport. And this was a pilot who donated his time. FedEx offered a brand new month-old jet, and we loaded up in Utah with 90 pallets of solar panels donated by a CEO of SunPower, who said, I can't sell these, but I can donate them to your nonprofit for a tax benefit. And he says, I'm paying rent on a warehouse full of stuff I can't sell, so come get these pallets. Well, this logistics partnership really lined up nicely. We did 3 solar airlifts since Maria and have solarized 180 community centers. The first year was mostly about getting the lights on because the federal government was moving slowly, but the NGO space was moving rapidly. And we operated with an ecosystem approach, which means we collaborated with nonprofits smaller than us and nonprofits bigger than us in a middle out approach of bringing materials in and feeding and seeding with materials as well as knowledge about how to rapidly install. Meanwhile, on the left, there was a company from Montana who got the contract to rebuild the grid. And they were doing things like this, just rapid install and putting the grid back up with coconut trees that were still standing and just really terrible quality work. And to me, the grid was the problem, whereas each of these grid installations on a telephone pole was the equivalent of 3 families that can get free solar. As the year evolved, we got away from the emergency. And we had a lot of students who were coming along with us and learning, Puerto Ricans young kids who want to learn more about what we were doing and joining us on these brigades. And so we kind of formalized that into what was called the Solar Libre class. And it was to take, local youth, mostly women, and educate them on solar, but also an apprenticeship that certifies them. And this project is the Isabella Hospital, which had its doors closed. We're able to open the emergency room by installing this solar generator and keep the X-ray machines going, and they service 60,000 people in the area. Several of these artists reached out and said, we've been helping out, but we want to get on the field. We had Victor Cruz. Victor Cruz here is the NFL Giants wide receiver. His family's from Arecibo, Puerto Rico, and he came down and helped us physically get this work onto the roof. And Ai Weiwei, the dissident artist, helped us energize a women-owned bakery in Caunias in the mountains. And Justin Bryce Guariglia, a climate artist, also stepped in and did some heavy lifting. But the Solar Libre program has now evolved into a women-led program, and I've stepped away from actively running the program, and I spend my time fundraising on the mainland and sending resources to these women who are kind of an each one teach one model. They're each teaching each other about solar, as well as leadership positions in the solar industry, and some are interested in entrepreneurship. And so we're investing and incubating their own companies as they grow. These are high school and college age women, which typically that age leaves the island because there isn't a lot of opportunity. Yet there's this emerging opportunity in energy. And so we want to connect the dots and reverse that brain drain. And so with the help of Solar, with Samsung Foundation and Victor Cruz and Hispanic Federation, we had our first graduating class of Solar Libre. And one of the managers is now is a graduate. One of our best graduates is now running the program down in Puerto Rico. Her name is Paula Pagan Berrios. And I'll leave you with this last slide. I hope the audio works. One of the community centers we found several months after the hurricane passed was an orphanage with kids that were the same age as my son who hadn't been without power or food for a long time. They had some local contributions of food and water from companies, but FEMA hadn't showed up. And it was heartbreaking for me to see my own government neglecting, a house full of kids in my own country. And how can that be, right? And so thankfully, the NGO space was able to work at the edges of the grid and provide some optimism. In this case, the children had optimistically decorated this Christmas tree, anticipating the coming Christmas, but they didn't have any power. And we were able to demonstrate with them how just putting solar panels and some batteries is able to provide power for the house, and there is no need for the grid. And so I'll try to hit play on this and hopefully it works.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Energía de sol. Toda la energía de sol, el corriente. Mira, Carlito. Mira, no hay que prender la planta, ¿lo ves?
Anyway, thanks for your time today. I look forward to the Q&A.
Walter, thank you. That was very inspiring. You've done great work and you show how to not only address climate change, but to do it with heart. So thank you very much for your presentation. And now for our last panelist, I have the honor to introduce Alan Robock, who is a distinguished professor of he's a distinguished professor of environmental science at Rutgers University. He's a meteorologist and a climate scientist, and he will be speaking in about we've gone very local, and now this is global, atmospheric, stratospheric, if you will. And so thank you very much for doing this, Alan, and we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you for inviting me. Yes, I'm going to talk about a different scale. So here's the story. We want to be happy, so we get stuff, and stuff consumes energy, and a lot of energy emits carbon dioxide when we burn coal, oil, and natural gas, and a lot stays in the atmosphere for a very long time. And this produces climate change, which produces impacts, many of which are negative. This is the problem with global warming. And the question is, how can we break this cycle? So you've heard a lot about this already. We can use less stuff, or use energy more efficiently, or power us with sun and wind, which is low carbon energy. These are all green. This is all mitigation. But absent that, people have talked about geoengineering, which would be taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that's causing climate change, or reflecting sunlight to cause cooling to counteract that. And absent that, we have adaptation. Absent that, we have suffering. So I work on particles in the upper atmosphere, and this one flavor of geoengineering is like treating the illness. This one is like treating the symptoms, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So the idea is that we could reflect sunlight by putting things in space, or creating a cloud in the upper atmosphere, like volcanic eruptions do every once in a while, to reflect sunlight, or taking clouds lower down and brightening them, or brightening the surface. And it's the reflecting sunlight from clouds in the stratosphere is the thing that most people are working on. So I've been studying this for more than 10 years, and I've written down reasons why it might benefit us. If you could do it, you would reduce global warming and its impacts, but all the possible risks involved. And I think we have to study this to see whether, if we ever do it, it's riskier than not doing it. And so that's what I spend time doing. And one of the things we can do is run climate models to calculate how the climate would change. A climate model is nothing more than a computer program that simulates how the weather behaves. And we use them every day to make weather forecasts. And we run them much longer, we can see longer term climate. We can't precisely predict the weather on a particular day, but we can get statistical representation of the climate system. And what we found is that, yes, if you can create a cloud in the stratosphere, which by the way, you can't do today because the technology doesn't exist, but there are schemes that people have proposed, flying airplanes up and spraying sulfur dioxide gas like volcanoes do. If you could do that, you could reduce global warming, but you would also produce drought in Africa and Asia and deplete ozone, have more ultraviolet radiation. And with climate models, we can calculate these things. With volcanoes, we can also study how past volcanoes affected the climate system and address some of the same things. Let me just show, but if we, there's other things on my list that we can't test either with modeling or with volcanoes. And so, for example, there would be, could be human error during implementation. So if you're in a car today and you put on your seatbelt, you understand that anything built by humans and operated by humans can fail. God forbid you have a car accident. Hopefully your seatbelt and your airbags will save you, but it won't destroy the whole planet. But it's easy to think of more complicated systems that humans have built that people have said, oh yeah, these are perfect, like the Boeing 737 MAX or the Fukushima nuclear reactor, which can fail because people make mistakes. And so would you trust the whole planet to some system of flying airplanes up and spraying sulfur and trust that nothing would go wrong? And we don't even know all the things there might be unexpected consequences. And we couldn't stop it quickly if something went wrong. How can we agree on whose hand would be on the thermostat? How would we want to, would Canada and Russia still want it a little bit warmer and others want it much cooler, which could even produce a conflict between countries? So if we're ever going to do it, this is a diagram called the napkin diagram drawn by John Shepard on a napkin at a conference 10 years ago. And he said, look, if we do business as usual, the temperature, the global temperature is going to go up and up and up. And 2 degrees Celsius or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial is what we consider dangerous. So let's do some geoengineering. Let's try and suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that will get us, let's do some mitigation. Let's reduce our emissions, get down to here. Let's do some geoengineering, get down to here. But still, the temperatures might be above the dangerous level. So let's do some solar radiation modification. Let's do some spraying to reduce the impacts, get down to here. And then we'll still have to do some adaptation and we'll still have some impacts. But, you know, look at the axis on this. This is for 100 years, more than 100 years. Can you think of any organization, any institution that could sustain this for that long and could compensate some of the people that might be disadvantaged by this? So I think these governance issues of how to do it and maintaining it and all these other impacts might prevent us from ever doing it. So the question is, if we ever do this, would it be more dangerous to do this than to not do it at all? So that's it. I'll give a brief talk and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. And now we'll open this for questions to any of our speakers. I know that there were a couple of questions for Alba in the Q&A, and one is, are there any significant differences between regular wind farms and offshore ones?
There are. I would say the most obvious one is that the onshore one, you would be required to install on land, and that would essentially cause maybe more noise pollution, as well as it is difficult to find the space for those installation on land versus in the water. And I would say that offshore would also generate more power than onshore due to the stronger winds that you would encounter at sea.
Okay.
There's also a major difference when it comes to cost, but usually onshore wind farms are less costly to install than offshore.
Okay. And I don't know if it is your or my machine. I did not hear that last answer. What is Equinor doing specifically about subsonic noise emissions?
I had mentioned that we are hoping to use gravity-based foundations to the largest extent. And if we do, the purpose of them is to eliminate noise emissions. And where we have to use monopile foundations, we're going to use the latest technology possible to reduce any subsonic noise emissions. We do a lot of noise impact analysis where we have a lot of marine life observers to assess any sort of risk or any sort of endangered marine life in the area so that we can use the best technology possible to reduce those subsonic noise emissions.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Thank you.
can't hear her either.
Yeah, I did not hear the last part of your answer again.
Can you hear me better?
Yes, I can.
Have to get closer to the computer. No, what I was saying was, did you hear the part where I said we are looking to use gravity-based structures as foundations? The purpose of that is to eliminate subsonic noise. So we're trying to use those foundations to the largest extent of the project. In instances that we have to use monopile foundations, we're using the latest technologies available. We do a lot of noise impact assessments to ensure that we are using the latest technology to reduce any subsonic noise emissions.
Okay, I think what's happening is somehow your video is delayed, but we have heard the answer. And
Okay, thank you.
okay, for Walter, I'm interested in the Rockaway. How many people are going to be in that development? What's there now, and what has been there before this development?
Yeah, so it's a site that was cleared by Robert Moses. And then this site has been now designated as a public-private partnership with HPD to redevelop with a consortium of developers and to be a place for first right of refusal for Rockaway residents to be able to rent into or buy into. So there's micro housing vis-a-vis bungalows that will be a rung on the ladder between subsidized housing and first home ownership in New York City.
Okay. Alan, a question for you about, does the technology exist now to actually produce clouds or block out some of the sun, as in some of the goals of geoengineering?
No, the technology does not exist. Current airplanes can't fly up into the stratosphere and spray the chemicals that we would need. So there are on the drawing board some ideas of how to build them, but they don't exist, and it would take 10 or more years to develop them. But I don't see any development starting right now. So you can't do it tomorrow. But as we've just heard, the technology does exist to solve the global warming problem. We have to leave the fossil fuels in the ground, and we can power our society with wind and with solar. And that technology exists, and we just need to do a better job of storage and distribution, but we're working on that. And a gradually increasing sewer fee for dumping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would solve the problem. If you had to pay like you pay when you flush your toilet or throw your trash out, and if the money collected was redistributed equally to all people in the country, then that would be a huge incentive not to dump CO2 in the atmosphere, and also to develop the technology that would allow people to do that. And so I don't even want to be working on this, because I know global warming is a problem. I know humans are causing it. I know what the solution is. The problem is political. It's not technical. And so far, it looks like geoengineering will not be a plan B, because it's much too risky. Some of these risks, I think, are insoluble. So what we really have to do is build on what Alba and Walter have been talking about. I've got solar panels on my roof. I drive an electric car, but I can afford that. But we have to make it affordable for everybody. And that's the way to solve the problem.
Okay, so
jump in.
Sure. No, that's all right. I was going to ask one. Take the moderator's privilege to ask one question. We recently had a president of the United States, Alba, who heard from a guy who heard from a guy who heard from a guy that wind power causes cancer? A simple yes or no answer.
No.
And I will,
I'm not a medical professional, but I would say no.
I will leave it at that. Thank you very much. And I'm going to thank you for the panelists. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now. Bye now.
Thank you
very
so much, Richard.
you.
And
Thank you.
Alba, Walter, and Alan, what a fascinating panel, especially for a College of Technology. But we leave on exactly the right note because our next panel coming up deals with policy. So thank you, Alan, for leading us there. The next panel is Policy, Laws, and Regulations, the Biden administration, the first 100 days of change. Professor Ilya Azarov will moderate from the Architectural Technology Department,